The girl at the gas station had her mother's eyes. That was the first thought Gunnery Sergeant Declan Marsh had when she appeared at the edge of the lot, standing in the gravel between the pump island and the highway's shoulder, watching him with a directness that most adults had long since learned to give up. He had her age wrong by 2 years because she was small for 9 and wore a coat that was too big and a single braid that had mostly come undone, and the November wind coming down off the Missouri hills was cutting enough to make a grown man wince. She did not wince. She walked straight toward him across the frost-cracked asphalt. And Boone, who had been sitting at Declan's heel while the gas pump ran, lifted his head and moved before Declan registered the approach. Not a growl. Not a warning. Boone simply stepped forward and waited for her, which was something he almost never did with strangers. And the girl reached down without hesitation and pressed her open palm against the top of the shepherd's broad head, as though she had done it 100 times before. Declan watched. The pump clicked and stopped. "She hasn't eaten since Tuesday," the girl said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, which was its own kind of grief. I didn't know who else to ask. If you want to stay with this story, please subscribe, turn on the bell, and watch until the very end. He was 41 years old, 6'2", and lean in the way that long years of physical labor produce rather than vanity, with dark hair gone mostly salt and pepper at the temples, and a jaw that carried a faint diagonal scar from a piece of shrapnel that had found him in Helmand Province in 2009. He was a gunnery sergeant, had been for the last 8 years of a 22-year career that ended 14 months ago with a medical discharge for a partially reconstructed left knee that worked fine in dry weather and reminded him of itself constantly when the cold came. His eyes were a pale, weathered green, the kind that looked like they had been washed out by too much sun and too many long scans of terrain, and they had the quality people always noticed first and rarely described accurately. Not cold, not kind, watchful in the way of someone who had never in his adult life stopped tracking the exits of any room he entered. He was passing through. That was what he had told himself when he pulled off Highway 50, just east of Calvert Mills, because the low-fuel light had been on for 11 miles. He was heading to Joplin, where his Uncle Raymond had called twice in the last month and Declan had not called back. That fact sitting in his chest like a small, hard stone he kept pressing. He was not looking for a reason to stop. The girl's name was Lily. She offered this without being asked, as children sometimes do when they have been carrying something alone, long enough that the first requirement of asking for help is simply to become real to another person. Lily Mae Calloway, age 9, and she had walked 1.5 miles from the mobile home park east of the grain elevator because she had seen a soldier's truck at the gas station, and that had seemed like a reason. Declan's truck was a gray half-ton with a U.S. Marine Corps sticker on the back window he kept meaning to remove. Her grandmother was Ruth, she said. Ruth Calloway, who lived in Space 14 at Hargrove Mobile Estate, and who had not been well since the heat went out 6 days ago, and who had not eaten since Tuesday, because there was nothing in the house. Ruth had told Lily she was not hungry, which Lily said was not true, because she had watched her grandmother the way children watch adults they are afraid for, with a total and unsparing attention. Boone sat between them, his amber eyes moving from Declan's face to Lily's face and back. Declan asked where her parents were. Lily said her father lived in Springfield and that she was staying with Ruth while he sorted some things out. That he was not answering his phone, but she had left 3 messages. She said this without bitterness, which was a kind of dignity that hit Declan somewhere in the sternum. He bought water and crackers from the gas station and gave them to Lily. And then he drove his truck east along the county road while she sat in the passenger seat, and Boone occupied the back with his chin on the center console. Declan knew this road type. He had grown up 40 miles north of here, in a town called Ferris Creek that no longer existed under its original name. He knew the flat grade of the Missouri river bottom country in late November, the way the sycamores went the color of old bone, and the fields went the gray-brown of something discarded, and the particular quality of light that came off a low overcast in the third week of November, which was not threatening and not gentle, but simply indifferent. He had left this kind of country 20 years ago and had not managed to entirely leave it since. Hargrove Mobile Estate sat back from the county road behind a gravel entrance lane and a wooden sign that had lost 2 of its 4 mounting screws so that it hung at a tilt that suggested either neglect or irony. There were 22 spaces in the park, Lily told him, but only 7 had people in them now. The others had been empty for more than a year, some leaving just the concrete pads and the utility hookup standing in the frost-gray grass like the foundations of something that had changed its mind. Space 14 was near the back. The home was a single wide from the early 1990s with white siding, gone to cream, and a small wooden porch addition that someone had built with care, because the boards were tight and the railing was solid, and the steps did not give when Declan put his weight on them. There were 2 clay pots on the porch that had been planted with something in warmer weather and now held only dry stalks. A wind chime made of painted wooden fish hung from the eave and made no sound because the morning had gone very still. Boone went up the steps first. Declan knocked. When no answer came after 30 seconds, he knocked again and said his name and that he was with Lily. And after another pause, the door opened 4 inches, and he saw Ruth Calloway for the first time. She was 73 years old, and she had the kind of face that had once been broad and expressive and was now drawn inward, the way a fire draws inward when the fuel is running low, all the light concentrated in a smaller space. Her white hair was thin and pinned with a clip that was not entirely holding. Her eyes were a clear, pale blue, striking in contrast to her pallor, because the rest of her face had gone the gray-white of someone whose body had been drawing on its reserves for longer than was safe. She wore a fleece robe over a house dress and 2 pairs of socks and a cardigan over all of it, and she was not warm enough. Declan could see that from outside the door. The air coming through was cold in the way interior air is cold, when the heat source has been absent long enough to reach equilibrium with the November outside. She looked at Lily first, then she looked at Declan. Then she looked at Boone, who had sat down on the porch with the patience of something that understood the situation and was prepared to wait. "He's well-mannered," Ruth said of the dog. Her voice had the gravel of someone who had not been drinking enough water. "He is," Declan said. "My name is Declan Marsh. I'm passing through. Lily said you might need some help." Ruth looked at her granddaughter with an expression precisely divided between gratitude and exasperation. Then she stepped back and opened the door. The interior confirmed what the cold air at the door had implied. The thermostat on the wall read 49 degrees. The furnace, a floor-standing unit in the corner of the living room, was dark and silent. There was a space heater in the bedroom that Lily had been running on an extension cord. But it was small, and the single bedroom was only marginally warmer than the rest. The kitchen was clean, and that was the precise problem with it. The counters were bare. The fruit bowl on the table held a single browning pear, and the dish drainer held a single cup and a single plate, both dry. Ruth sat in the armchair nearest the dark furnace, because it had been her habit to sit there when the heat was running, and her body had not entirely abandoned the habit. Boone walked to the side of her chair and lay down beside it. Ruth looked at him for a moment, and then, with the deliberateness of someone making a small and significant decision, rested her hand on his back. Something in Declan released a pressure he had not known he was holding. He asked Ruth when she had last eaten, and she said yesterday morning, then corrected herself to Wednesday, then looked at the window and said she was not quite sure anymore and that the days had been running together since she stopped sleeping properly when the cold came on. The furnace had stopped running 6 days ago. She had called the number on her lease and been told a maintenance request had been filed and that someone would be in touch. No one had been in touch. She had called again and been told the same thing by a different voice. She said none of this with complaint. She narrated it the way a woman who had spent her professional life in a classroom narrated things, with a dry, precise economy that was not resignation, but was something close to it. She had taught 8th grade history and civics at Calvert Mills Middle School for 27 years. She had retired when her husband Harold had gotten sick, and she had sat with him every day for 3 years until he died. And she had continued to live in their home, because it was hers and it had Harold's workbench, in the shed out back, and she was not going anywhere. Declan drove to the grocery store and came back with enough for several days. He made Ruth eat before he looked at the furnace, a bowl of soup he heated on the stove, and he sat at the kitchen table while she ate it and did not pretend to look anywhere else, because watching her eat was what the situation required, and he was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. Lily sat beside her grandmother and had a bowl of soup too. The two of them ate without ceremony, side by side, and Boone watched from the living room floor with his head on his paws. The furnace was a propane unit, and the problem was that the propane tank outside was empty, not malfunctioning. Empty. Declan walked around the exterior and checked the tank gauge, which read 0, then checked 3 of the other occupied homes and found 2 of those tanks also empty, or near empty. He stood in the dead grass beside the tank and looked at the gravel lane, and the tilted sign at the entrance and the flat, overcast sky pressing down on the tree line, and something settled into place in his assessment of the situation that moved it from the category of neglect into a different category entirely. He went back inside and asked Ruth if he could see her lease and her recent billing statements. She kept them in a manila folder in a kitchen drawer. Her lease was for a monthly lot fee of $210, which she had been paying reliably since 2019 when Hargrove Property Management had acquired the park from the previous owner, a local man named Dale Pryor who had operated it for 30 years. Since Hargrove had taken over, the lot fee had been supplemented by manufactured service charges, maintenance access fees, common area assessments, and a property improvement charge of $68 per month, with no description beyond those 3 words. These charges appeared in a 1-page addendum that arrived in the mail the previous year, with language saying that by continuing to occupy the property past a certain date, the tenant acknowledged acceptance of the new terms. Ruth had not known this meant new charges. The addendum had said adjusted terms of lease agreement, which was different. The total additional charges per month came to $120. Over 16 months, that was $1,920, billed in excess of the original lease. Ruth was currently, according to the most recent statement, $340 behind on the manufactured service fees, and there was a notice clipped to the back of the folder informing her that failure to resolve the outstanding balance by the 18th of the month would result in initiation of eviction proceedings. Today was the 16th. Declan set the papers down and looked at the table for a moment without saying anything. Boone, from the living room, raised his head and watched him. "Has anyone from the management company been here recently?" Declan asked. "In person?" Ruth said yes. A man had come by approximately 3 weeks ago. She described him as being around 50, well-dressed for the county, in a dark blazer and dress pants that did not belong in a mobile home park in November, with very good teeth and a watch that cost more than her monthly income. He had introduced himself as Gerald Finch, regional property manager for Hargrove, and told her in the warmest possible tones that the company was evaluating the property for potential improvements and that existing tenants would, of course, be accommodated. He had smiled when he said this. Ruth said it was the kind of smile that arrived before the sentiment it was supposed to accompany, which was the smile of someone practicing at warmth rather than feeling it. He patted my hand, Ruth said. I did not offer it to him. Declan asked if he could make a few calls. Ruth said she would make more soup. He called the propane company and learned that the delivery account for Hargrove Mobile Estate had been placed on administrative hold 6 weeks ago at Hargrove's request. The account had not been canceled. Suspended. 6 weeks. The tank had run dry inside 3 weeks, which meant that for the last 3 weeks, the 7 occupied spaces had been running on stored propane. And when that ran out in November in Missouri, with a 73-year-old woman and a 9-year-old child in an uninsulated single-wide, the situation had a specific word attached to it, and the word was not oversight. He walked the gravel lane and knocked on doors. 4 households responded. 3 were elderly women between 68 and 79, each with the same addendum, the same manufactured charges, and the same eviction warning dated the 18th. The 4th was Carl Brewer, a man of 60 on a fixed disability income who answered the door with the expression of someone who had been waiting for the knock and was not sure which kind it was going to be. All 4 had empty or near-empty propane tanks. One of the women, a 71-year-old named Paulette Hines, had been heating her home with her oven for 5 days because she did not know what else to do. Declan went back to Ruth's and used her kitchen table as a desk and wrote down everything he had collected on a notepad from the kitchen drawer. Names, dates, dollar amounts, the propane company account number, the dates of the addendum and the eviction notice, the name Gerald Finch, the company name Hargrove Property Management and its Kansas City corporate address from the letterhead, the number of occupied units, the number of empty units, the year the park had been acquired, Paulette Hines and her oven. Boone had moved to a position beside Declan's chair, and every few minutes he looked toward the front door, then back at Declan, then toward the front door again. Declan noticed this on the 3rd repetition and shifted his chair so that he could see the porch from where he sat. Gerald Finch's car was a dark blue sedan, late model, clean and incongruous, parked at the entrance of the gravel lane in a way that suggested its owner was deciding whether to come in. It sat there for approximately 4 minutes. Then it pulled slowly forward. Boone stood up. He did not growl. He positioned himself between Declan and the door with the stillness of a working dog who understood the geometry of the room and had taken his place in it. Finch knocked with the confident, even rhythm of someone who expected his knock to be welcomed. When Declan opened the door, Finch's expression moved through 3 positions in about 1/4 of a second. Surprise because he had expected Ruth. Assessment. Because Declan was a large man who stood in doorways the way men trained to hold positions stand in doorways. Then the smile, which arrived right on schedule and landed nowhere near his eyes. He was 52, Gerald Finch, with the build of a man who had been athletic in his 30s and maintained the outline of it without the effort. Dark hair receding at the temples, a charcoal herringbone blazer that was not a county road blazer, and a watch that was exactly as Ruth had described it. "I'm looking for Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was practiced and warm, the voice of someone accustomed to talking to people who were not on equal footing with him. I heard there had been a problem with the utilities. I just wanted to stop by personally. Declan said that was considerate of him. Finch said he didn't believe they had met. Declan said they hadn't, and gave his name. Finch looked past Declan's shoulder into the home, where Ruth was visible at the kitchen table, and where Boone was visible standing beside the table, looking directly at Finch, with an attention that was not hostile and was not calm, but occupied the careful middle space between them, the space that meant the dog had made his assessment and was keeping it current. Finch's smile did not entirely hold when he met the dog's eyes. He adjusted it and said he was glad to see Mrs. Calloway had some company, that it was important for residents not to feel isolated, and that he hoped they could get the utility situation worked out quickly, because he understood it had been an inconvenience. Declan said it had been more than an inconvenience. Finch said he understood, and said the company was looking at the full picture of the property, and said, in the tone of someone turning a corner, that he hoped Declan understood this was a private management matter between Hargrove and its tenants, and that while guests were of course welcome, matters of tenancy and billing were really best addressed through official channels. The word guests. Declan looked at Finch for a moment. The propane hold was placed by Hargrove 6 weeks ago, Declan said. That's documented. 7 occupied spaces, 3 tanks empty, 1 tenant heating her home with her oven for 5 days. Mrs. Calloway has not eaten since Tuesday. He paused. Today is Thursday. Finch's smile adjusted again, fractionally. He said he was sorry to hear that, and that certainly it would be looked into, and then he said, in a voice that had gone very still underneath the warmth, that he hoped Mrs. Calloway understood the terms of her current lease situation. Boone made a sound. Not a growl. Not quite. A low settling of breath that was somehow louder than a growl would have been. The sound of a large and patient animal that had been paying attention and had reached its preliminary conclusion. Finch looked at the dog, and for the first time the smile did not come back. Declan said he thought Mr. Finch had what he needed from this visit. Finch left. His footsteps on the porch steps were careful and even, and his car left the park at a deliberate speed that was not the speed of someone unconcerned. Declan drove to the county sheriff's department and asked for whoever handled civil complaints. The deputy who came to the front desk was Sheila Vance, 38, with close-cut dark hair and the compact alertness of someone who had grown up in this county and knew precisely what it contained. She had been a deputy for 11 years. She listened to Declan for 6 minutes without interrupting, then returned with a legal pad of her own. Her grandmother, she said, looking at the table rather than at Declan, had been in a situation not entirely different from this one. 3 years ago, different county, different management company, same basic architecture. She said the word architecture, the way someone uses a technical term they have earned. The propane hold would move fastest, she said, because that was a deliberate interruption of an essential utility to vulnerable residents in winter conditions, and the landlord-tenant code was unambiguous about that. The manufactured service charges would take longer. The eviction notices could be stayed immediately on grounds that they were products of fraudulent billing not properly disclosed to tenants. She said she would make calls that afternoon. She said Gerald Finch was a name she wanted to write down. Declan went back to the park. Norma Pruitt was already there. Norma Pruitt was 58 years old and ran a diner on the main street of Calvert Mills her mother had opened in 1979. The kind of place serving the kind of food requiring no description to anyone who had grown up within 30 miles of it. She was a large woman, with a gray braid down her back and the forearms of 30 years of commercial kitchen work, and she had heard from Carl Brewer 45 minutes after Declan knocked on his door. She arrived with foil trays of food and a bin of groceries and organized Ruth's kitchen with the efficiency of someone for whom feeding people was not a gesture, but a discipline. She sat down across from Ruth and held Ruth's hands in both of her own and said, in a voice that was not soft, but was entirely genuine, "Why didn't you call me, you stubborn woman?" Ruth said she had not wanted to be a bother. Norma said that was the most ridiculous thing she had heard in 20 years of running a diner in a county where everybody's business was everybody else's business, and they had all been better for it. Boone sat beside Ruth's chair with his chin on her knee, and Ruth's hand rested on his head. Earl Duggan arrived at 3:30 carrying canned goods, a bag of dog food because he had noticed Boone through the window, and a toolbox. Earl was 62, a Vietnam-era veteran with a leg brace he wore without complaint, and a face that had the geography of someone who had survived more than one thing not supposed to be survivable. He had 3 days of gray stubble, and an old army coat he wore because it fit, and he set his toolbox on the counter and said to Declan, without preamble, that he heard there was a furnace that needed looking at. They got the furnace running 2 hours later, after a temporary propane fill from a portable tank Earl had brought, and the replacement of a faulty igniter board that Earl diagnosed with the efficiency of a man who had fixed a great many things by necessity. The furnace kicked on at 5:10, and when the thermostat read 62 degrees, Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. Declan saw her do it and looked away. The other occupied homes were attended to over the next 2 hours, Carl Brewer moving from space to space with Earl and the portable propane tank, and a woman named Diane Voss, who had arrived at 4:30 and decided without discussion that the situation required her presence. Paulette Hines wept when her furnace came on, quietly, standing in her kitchen with her arms wrapped around herself, and said sorry, and then said she was not actually sorry, and that she had not cried in a long time. Norma brought food to each household as dark fell. By the time the last of the light was gone, there were lights in 7 windows where earlier there had been the particular darkness of homes where people were managing rather than living. Deputy Vance called at 6:47 to say that a utility restoration order had been applied for and would be served on Hargrove Property Management by morning, that Gerald Finch's name had been passed to the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit, and that the eviction proceedings were suspended pending review of the billing basis. She said the word suspended with a precision that suggested she had been waiting for an opportunity to say it in this context for some time. Ruth was asleep in her chair by 8. Boone had not left her side. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with her shoes still on, one arm hanging off the cushion, her braid come entirely undone so that her hair spread across the pillow in the way of a child so deeply asleep that the world had completely lost its grip on her. Declan sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee Norma had made before she left, and looked at the notepad on the table and the warm orange glow coming in under the door from the furnace vent. He had not planned to be here. He had been passing through to Joplin, 2 unanswered calls to his Uncle Raymond sitting in his chest like a stone he kept pressing with his thumb. He had been pressing it for 2 years, since his mother had been found alone in her house in Ferris Creek by a neighbor who noticed the mail piling up, and since Declan had stood in the hospital parking lot and understood that he had been deployed for 18 months and had not called back twice, and that the math of that was not something that would be revised simply because he wanted it to. She had survived. She had forgiven him with a completeness he could not accept. because the forgiveness came before he had earned it. He had been moving since her last birthday, taking the long way toward Joplin every time a reason to stop appeared, which had turned out to be often. Boone came into the kitchen at 9:30 and put his head in Declan's lap and looked up at him. Declan put his hand on the dog's head and looked back. He was still sitting there at 11 when Ruth woke from her chair and shuffled to the kitchen for a glass of water and stopped when she saw him still at the table with the cold coffee. She looked at him for a moment with her blue eyes in the kitchen light. Then she sat down across from him. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know." She turned the glass in her hands. Outside, the November wind had picked up and was moving through the bare trees along the back fence with a sound like a long breath being let out. "Harold stayed," she said, "when most men would have found a reason to go. I used to think that was just his nature. Now I think it was his decision. Every day of it." She paused. "You have that same quality. I don't know if you know that." Declan looked at the table. "Your mother would have stayed too," Ruth said. "Whatever kind of woman she is, I can see it." That hit him somewhere below his sternum and did not move. He did not say anything for a long time. Ruth did not require him to. She sat with her glass of water, and the furnace hummed in the next room, and Boone came back and settled at Ruth's feet. And the three of them were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when the crisis is past, and what remains is not emptiness, but something closer to its opposite. In the morning, Declan called his Uncle Raymond in Joplin and said he was going to be a little longer than expected. Raymond said he had not actually been expecting him on any particular timeline, which was the kindest thing Raymond could have said, and which was, Declan suspected, exactly what Raymond had intended. He fixed Ruth's porch railing, which had developed a wobble at the left post, that he noticed on his second trip across the porch and could not leave alone. Carl Brewer helped him, and then Earl arrived mid-morning, and the three of them got the shed unlocked. Where Harold Calloway's workbench was, the tools hung on a pegboard in the careful arrangement of a man who had valued his things, and they used Harold's tools to complete the porch repair and then refitted a storm window on Paulette Hines's home that had been leaking cold air around the frame for the better part of a month. Norma brought lunch to the park at noon and the information that she had spoken to a reporter at the county paper who covered property disputes and who had been very interested in the phrase utility cutoff in November. Hargrove Property Management was served with the utility restoration order at 10:15 that morning. Deputy Vance called to confirm it and to add that the Attorney General's office had opened a preliminary inquiry into the service fee addendum practice, not only for Hargrove Mobile Estate, but for 5 other properties in 3 counties where the same addendum had been applied to elderly tenants. Gerald Finch's name was in it. Finch himself was not reachable by phone, his office in Kansas City said, because he was traveling. His car was not seen again at the park. By the 3rd day, the 7 households had formed the kind of informal community that disaster and relief produce when the people involved are already neighbors, simply prevented from being neighborly by 14 months of management that treated them as liabilities rather than lives. Paulette Hines brought her card table to Ruth's, and they played rummy in the afternoons. A woman named Georgia Falk, 79 years old, with the energy of someone considerably younger, organized the common area and raked the dead leaves into a pile she intended to burn when the wind allowed. Lily's father arrived on the 4th day, a thin man of 34 named Gary Calloway, who had the look of someone present partly out of obligation and partly out of a shame he did not know how to hold gracefully. He stood in his mother's kitchen and looked at the food on the counter and the notepad on the table, and Boone sitting beside Ruth's chair and did not say what he was thinking. Ruth said she was glad he came. She said it simply and meant it simply, which was the most devastating thing she could have said. Gary stayed 2 days and signed the documentation Deputy Vance needed and told his mother he was going to call every week. Ruth said she knew he would, which was a mercy she was extending to him that he did not fully understand yet. On the morning of the 6th day, Ruth had her episode. Declan was outside checking the propane line connections when he heard Lily's voice go high and sharp and call his name, and he was through the front door in 4 seconds, and Boone was already at Ruth's side, pressing his body against her leg where she had slumped in her armchair with her hand at her chest, and her color wrong. The gray-white of Tuesday returned to her face without warning. He called emergency services and kept Ruth calm and warm and talking, though she apologized for the trouble more times than was necessary, and Boone lay against her feet and did not move until the paramedics came through the door and then moved aside with the precision of a dog who knew when a room needed to be given over to someone else. The paramedics said it was a cardiac event, mild, the kind that in a healthier baseline would have remained subclinical, but that in a woman who had spent 6 days in a cold house without adequate food had found more purchase than it should have. She was stable. The cold exposure and the malnutrition had both contributed, and that was important to document. The word document was one that Deputy Vance, who arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after the ambulance, understood in its fullest implications. Ruth was in the hospital for 4 days. Norma arranged for Lily to stay at her house, in a guest room the girl occupied with the adaptability of a child who had learned not to require too much continuity. Boone went with Declan to the hospital twice, and both times the nursing staff pretended not to notice him on grounds that were unstated but mutual. The morning Ruth came home, Norma and Georgia Falk had cleaned the home and brought fresh groceries and put flowers in the clay pots on the porch, dry silk ones from the craft store, because the season was wrong for anything living, but the pots had been empty too long and someone had decided to address that. Declan had replaced the failing seal on the front door so the drafts were gone, and Earl had installed a second small heater as a backup, properly wired this time. Ruth walked up the porch steps on Declan's arm, slowly and with the dignity of someone who understood that accepting help was its own kind of strength, and had made her peace with that. She looked at the flowers in the clay pots. She looked at the fixed doorframe. She went inside and looked at the kitchen and at Boone waiting in the living room and at the warm orange light from the furnace vent and the thermostat reading 68 degrees. She sat in her chair, and Boone went to her immediately and put his head in her lap. She put both hands on him and was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. Not to anyone in particular. To the room, maybe, or to the general proposition that life had something further to offer and she was prepared to meet it. The State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit sent an investigator 2 weeks later who confirmed what Declan's notepad had already mapped. The service fee addendum was a manufactured revenue stream deployed against elderly and fixed-income tenants in properties where Hargrove was simultaneously negotiating with retail development interests about land acquisition. The 14 acres of Hargrove Mobile Estate had an active letter of intent from a regional retail chain, contingent on vacant possession. The eviction notices, the suspended utilities, the manufactured arrears. The math was not complicated. Gerald Finch was placed on administrative leave. The manufactured service charges were vacated for all 7 households, and the overpayments ordered into restitution. The eviction proceedings were dismissed. Hargrove's broader portfolio of mobile home properties was flagged for audit. The reporter from the county paper wrote the story. The regional wire picked it up. Gerald Finch's name was in it. And so was the detail about Paulette Hines and her oven, because that was the detail that made the story real to people who read it in their warm houses and felt something they had not expected to feel. Declan was in the story, too, briefly, described as a Marine veteran passing through, which was accurate as far as it went. He did not end up passing through. He called Raymond 2 weeks after Ruth came home and said he was going to stay in Calvert Mills for a while. Raymond said that sounded like sense. He found a room on the west side of town and helped Carl Brewer install gutters on 3 homes in the park that November, and helped Earl repaint 2 of them the following spring, and Boone became a fixture in the park in the way of dogs who choose a territory and hold it, greeting every resident with the deferential attention of someone keeping careful records. Ruth recovered fully, the cardiologist said, in the sense that her heart had survived without lasting damage, and that the primary interventions going forward were nutritional, stability, and warmth, and the absence of prolonged stress, all of which the community that had formed around Space 14 was in the business of providing without being asked and without calling it care. Lily came back for Christmas, and her father Gary came with her, and stayed 4 days and fixed the shed door that had been sticking, and said to Declan before he left that he was grateful for what Declan had done. Declan said he had only come because a girl at a gas station had asked him to, which was the true version of events, but not the complete one. On the last evening of the year, the sky cleared for the first time in 2 weeks, and the cold was specific and clean rather than gray and indeterminate, and Declan sat on Ruth's porch steps with a cup of coffee and his jacket on, and Boone sat beside him with his breath making small clouds in the still air. And through the window behind them the light was warm, and Ruth's card table was set up, and Norma was arriving with something she had cooked, and the sound of voices was the particular sound of people who had been afraid together and were no longer afraid, and had not forgotten what the fear had cost them, and had chosen to be here anyway. Ruth came to the door and looked out at Declan and the dog sitting on the steps in the cold. "You're letting the heat out," she said. "I know," Declan said. She came and sat beside him with her cardigan pulled around her, which was not entirely sensible in December, and they sat for a moment together in the cold, and Boone was between them, and the stars were out over the Missouri hills for the first time in a long time. This is not a story about a man who happened to stop for gas. It is a story about what happens when someone who has been moving too long finally stops moving and finds out what was waiting for him there. It is a story about a child with the courage to ask a stranger for help because the alternative was worse. It is a story about an old woman who heated the cold of 6 days by the presence of people who had decided she was worth arriving for. Every one of us, at some point, becomes someone who needs to be arrived for. We do not always know when it will be. We do not always know if someone will come. What this story asks us to remember is that the person who comes is also changed by coming, that the grace of being needed is as real as the grace of being helped, and that the roads we travel without a destination sometimes deliver us to the only address that was ever truly ours. If this story has stayed with you, please share it with someone who might need it tonight. May God bless you, keep you warm, and fill your home with people who arrive without being asked and stay without needing a reason.